We finally fucking have an archetype of reptile monsters with graveyard effects. That means that Snake Rain is finally potentially broken. Snake Rain was released in 2007, 14 years ago, and oh my gosh, I mean, this is a card that people have always been talking about and saying this could potentially be broken in the future. It just needs the right deck, and we finally have the right deck. So this new archetype, the Abhyss archetype, and Abhyss is spelled differently because they don't want it to synergize with other Abhyss monsters like Burning Abyss or whatever. This is going to be released in Ancient Guardians. Now in the TCG, we will not see these cards until May of 2021, so we have a few months until then, but this is so exciting. I mean, when I saw these cards, my mind was just blown. I mean, we are finally getting a reptile archetype that you can use Snake Rain in, and it's going to be pretty good by the looks of it. So I'm just going to go through all the cards in today's video, kind of give you my first reactions. I think they look pretty promising. I think the artwork and the art style is really nice as well. You have these light and dark counterparts of all these different monsters, except the boss monster I think only has a light version. But this is really cool, and I am so excited to try this deck out. I mean, I just cannot wait for this deck to make its way into the TCG. This is so awesome. We've been waiting such a long time for a good deck to play Snake Rain in. Don't worry, by the way, it looks like Snake Rain is getting a reprint in Ancient Guardians, which means you won't have to spend ridiculous prices on the rare copy, because so far it has only been printed that one time back in 2007. So the reprint is really great. First up, we have Null, Drag of the Abyss, a level 4 light reptile. So this is a light snake. You'll see the next one is a dark snake. So this one says, you can send this card from your hand to the graveyard. Send one dark reptile monster from your deck to the graveyard. So that's pretty good already. You can see that they have graveyard synergy. We already have a monster that is a Foolish Burial. If you control no monsters, or if you control an Abhyss monster, you can special summon this card from your graveyard, but banish it when it leaves the field. You cannot special summon monsters while this card special summoned by this effect is in the monster zone, except reptile monsters, so they are sort of restricting you there. I will say though, we have gotten some pretty decent reptile extra deck monsters over the past couple of years though, so that's pretty interesting. So the Dark Drag of Abhyss is a level 4 dark reptile with 0 attack and 2000 defense, and this one says you can send this card from your hand to the graveyard, send one light reptile from your deck to the grave. So these cards seem like you want to open them, but obviously the first one is pretty good to send to the graveyard as well, because you can revive it if you control no monsters or if you control an Abhyss monster. The second effect on this card says if this card is normal or special summoned, you can add one Abhyss spell or trap from your deck to your hand. So this one you might not really want to send with the Snake Rain, but don't worry, there are plenty of other cards in the archetype that want to be in the graveyard. These two cards are like the main starters of the archetype as far as I can tell, and I think you'll want to play 3 copies of them because they seem very versatile. Next up, we have the level 4 light Haze of the Abhyss. So this is another light reptile monster. This one has better stats. It's 1800 attack and 1400 defense, and it says if this card is sent from the field to the graveyard or special summoned from the graveyard, you can target one face-up monster your opponent controls and one monster in their graveyard with an equal or higher attack. Special summon the target in the opponent's graveyard to their field, and if you do, send the target they control to the graveyard. This is a mechanic that you'll see on a few of these cards. You give your opponent a monster to do some sort of effect that could be pretty tricky, but it could potentially be good. If this card is in your graveyard, you can send one card from your hand to the graveyard, add this card to your hand. So already we are 3 cards in, and we have 2 monsters that we would maybe want to send off of Snake Rain, because this one does have that graveyard effect. The dark version of Haze of the Abhyss says this: if this card is sent from the field to the graveyard or special summoned from the graveyard, you can have your opponent draw 1 card, and if they do, add one Abhyss monster from your deck to your hand, except this card. Then each player sends 1 card from their hand to the graveyard. If this card is in your graveyard, you can send 1 card from your hand to the graveyard, add this card to your hand. And by the way, if you haven't noticed, all these cards, they're 1 and 2 effects are hard once per turns, but you can use each of them in the same turn, which is obviously pretty good. Moving on to the higher leveled monsters, we have a lot of graveyard effects here that are really interesting. So Curse Dawn of the Abyss is a level 8 light reptile that says if this card is in your graveyard, you contribute one monster, special summon this card, then your opponent can special summon one monster from their graveyard to their field, but its effects are negated. So yes, it does give your opponent a free monster, but it won't have any effects, and honestly, you'll probably just be able to run it over in battle. If this card is special summoned, you can target one level 4 or lower Abyss monster in your graveyard, special summon it, but banish it when it leaves the field. So while you do have to tribute one of your own monsters, and while you do have to give your opponent a monster, you are at least getting this card on the board and then special summoning a level 4 or lower Abyss monster from your graveyard. So it's not the worst trade-off, but I think there are better options. They have a King and Queen card that are really exciting. We'll talk about those in a few moments. First though, let's talk about Dusk of the Abyss, a level 8 dark reptile that says if this card is in your graveyard, you contribute one monster, special summon this card, then your opponent can add one monster from their graveyard to their hand. Now this is better in some situations than giving them a monster on their board, but obviously you don't want to give your opponent a hand trap or a starter card, and they are the one that gets to choose what monster they add back, so this could be pretty risky. If this card is special summoned, you can target 2 of your banished monsters, including at least one reptile monster, return them to the graveyard. So you've noticed already we have a couple cards that banish themselves or banish other monsters that you special summoned. This is a way to put them back. But let's move on to the King and Queen here, because this is where it gets really interesting. So the King is a level 8 light reptile that says if this card is in your graveyard, you contribute 2 monsters, special summon this card. It does not give your opponent any free cards, which is obviously very good. If your opponent adds a card or cards to the hand, except during the draw phase, you can send one random card from their hand to the graveyard. So that is a really good effect. Maybe you can snipe the card that they just added. Maybe you can hit a better card in their hand. Messing with your opponent's hand is always going to be a good effect. We've seen a similar effect on Masked Hero Darklaw, which forces your opponent to play in a pretty weird way. Finally, if a monster or monsters your opponent controls is sent to the graveyard by a card effect, you can add one light or dark reptile monster from your deck or graveyard to your hand, except King of the Abyss. We've already seen one card that this works with in the archetype. The level 4 Haze of the Abyss sends a monster your opponent controls to the graveyard, so that does combo with this, but more importantly, you are supposed to have King and Queen on the board at the same time, and then you're getting some pretty crazy effects. Queen of the Abyss is a dark reptile level 8, and this one has the same summoning condition. If it's in your graveyard, you contribute 2 monsters to special summon it. Worth noting here is that because this is a dark monster, potentially you could use it with Layer of Darkness. Now, I'm not sure if that's going to be super consistent, but it is something to keep in mind. Second, if a monster or monsters is special summoned from your opponent's graveyard, you can send one card they control to the graveyard. So now it makes more sense that we've seen a couple cards that can special summon monsters from your opponent's graveyard to their side of the field. If you control this, then you can send that monster right away, or potentially send a better monster they control to the graveyard while leaving them with the bad one. Finally, if a monster or monsters is sent from your opponent's hand or deck to the graveyard, you can special summon one light or dark reptile monster from your graveyard, except Queen of the Abyss. As you can see, the 2 effect of King is supposed to trigger the 3 effect of Queen, and the 2 effect of Queen is supposed to trigger the 3 effect of King. That is basically how the deck is trying to operate. You want to have these 2 cards on the field at the same time, and it seems like they're trying to give us ways to make that happen without too much of an investment. Finally, we have a big boss monster here, Deity of the Abyss, a level 10 reptile light monster, so that does mean maybe in the future we get a dark variant variant of this card, but at the moment we only have a light level 10 in this archetype. This one says if this card is in your graveyard, you contribute 3 monsters to special summon this card, so that is obviously a huge investment, but the payoff is pretty crazy. Once, while face up on the field, as a quick effect, you can send all monsters on the field to the graveyard except face up monsters that were special summoned from the graveyard. So obviously you are trying to send everything to the graveyard except the cards that you have revived from your own graveyard, because a lot of the cards in the archetype can do that. Overall, the monsters are looking pretty good, and obviously most of them do have some synergy with Snake Rain. They also have a field spell. This card has 2 effects. If a face-up reptile monster or monsters you control is destroyed by battle or an opponent's card effect, you can target 1 card your opponent controls, send it to the graveyard. So that already is just a really good effect, but also keep in mind that will trigger the effect of the king on the board. 2, if this card in your field zone is destroyed by an opponent's card effect, you can send cards from the top of your opponent's deck to the graveyard equal to the number of reptile monsters with different names in your graveyard. That might not seem super great because a lot of people will have cards in their deck that they want in the graveyard, but that will trigger the queen effect, which is pretty decent. Invasion of the Abyss is a normal trap card that is supposed to make it easier to special summon all of your graveyard monsters. So this thing says special summon 2 Abhyss tokens. They are Reptile Dark level 2, 0 attack, 0 defense monsters, but if you have 8 or more Abhyss monsters with different names in your graveyard, you can apply this effect instead. Special summon 2 reptile monsters with different names from your graveyard. Now, how likely is it to really have 8 different Abhyss monsters in your graveyard in the early stages of the game? Not super likely, but it could happen, and the payoff is pretty big because then you could summon King and Queen, and that would be a pretty big deal. Finally, we have Emptiness of the Abyss, a continuous trap that says during the main phase you contribute 1 reptile monster, then target 1 monster in your opponent's graveyard, special summon it to your field, but send it to the graveyard during the end phase. If this face-up card in the spell and trap zone is sent to the graveyard, send all face-up non-reptile monsters you control to the graveyard. And keep in mind here, the reptiles that you are using to activate the effect are probably going to have graveyard abilities, so it's kind of like a win-win. Overall, this archetype looks very interesting. I don't know how competitive it will be at launch, but certainly it seems like they are finally pushing Snake Rain to be a competitive card, which I think is really awesome. Anyway, thank you guys so much for watching today's video. I'll see you in the next one. Goodbye.